getting something out of a failed project. And the failed project was I'd been asked to write a textbook about post-war British theatre. And I felt that from my experiences of teaching students both here and in the United States, that a lot of things that when I was in my 20s and 30s, I took for granted, such as state subsidy of the arts and the censorship of theatre, those things actually needed explaining to people who are in their 20s or 30s now. And so I wrote a couple of sample chapters for this textbook of post-war British theatre. And of course, after I'd finished writing about all the things that I was interested in and explaining them at enormous length, the book sort of ballooned into inordinate amount of pages. I mean, my estimate is that it would be over 1,000 pages long to publish. So clearly it was a project that was a failure and that I would never actually get to write, because it was just, what interested me was just unpublishable. So out of that, I was reading several books about post-war British theatre, including books by Shellard and Raby, and of course Elsom, those kind of classics that I remember reading when I was much younger. And of course I was reading Michael Billington's State of the Nation. And there was a line in it that intrigued me, and I think it would be useful if I read it. It's only one sentence, so there's no need to get nervous. I'm not going to do a long reading. And basically the sentence was, since the truly popular plays of any period are the ones that tend to get omitted from histories of drama, it is worth recalling some of the big crowd pleasers. We could do a kind of textual analysis of that sentence. I'm struck by the phrase truly popular plays, as opposed to what? Of any period are the ones that tend to get omitted. That sounded like almost a challenge. You know, they tend to get omitted. Why? And also they're big crowd pleasers. And I wonder if it's just me or if colleagues share the feeling that a phrase like big crowd pleasers tend to have a bit of a tinge to it, as if there's something wrong with pleasing lots of people. Okay. The other thing that struck me about Michael Billington's book was that he followed that sentence by giving several examples. I'm just writing a couple of words about all of these plays, and they included plays such as R.F. Delderfield's Worm's Eye View from 1945, and he said it had 1,745 performances. And he gave a few other examples, also followed by the length of their initial runs. And I thought, oh, you know, maybe it's just because I'm a nerd, but I thought this is fascinating. You know, how can you actually know that there are 1,745 as opposed to 46 or 47 performances of a certain play? And so I was intrigued by this. And as you know, I do quite a lot of theatre reviewing, or I used to do a lot of theatre reviewing, and so did Michael Billington. And the next time I saw him at a press night, I asked him where he got those figures from, and he put me on something that I should have known about, but I didn't, which is called Who's Who in the Theatre. And as you can see, it's, I mean, if you want to exercise your biceps, you could get this book, because it's a real door stopper. And what's wonderful about it is that it's got potted biographies of thousands upon thousands of actors, directors, and playwrights. And it's also got a listings, about 10 pages of the long runs on the London stage from 1940. And that lists all the plays that achieved 250 performances in their initial run at a particular theatre. And looking down that, because it's all in columns, I could see that many plays, although by no means the majority, of course, had runs of more than 1,000. And then I started to think along the lines of, well, that's kind of interesting. 1,000 is a big number. What are these plays? Have I heard of them? And some I had, others, of course, I hadn't. And so the initial impetus for the book was really to look at these plays that usually get omitted from histories of drama, and especially the ones that achieved at least 1,000 performances in their initial runs. And of course, I counted them up, and it was almost, you know, in the 75 years after 1940, there was about 100 more or less of those kinds of plays. And I thought, well, 100 is manageable. You know, if I looked at every single play that had 250 performances, it would be thousands. So 100 seemed kind of manageable. And I thought, well, it's slightly random to choose 1,000, but on the other hand, it has a great symbolic sense, I think, 1,000. And in the real world, if you're running a show as a producer or as a director or even as an actor, for 1,000 performances, that's about 2.5 years worth. You know, you celebrate the 1,000th performance. You know, it's something that everybody kind of understands is a real milestone.
So you're moving away then from sort of common understandings of popular theatre as political, so John McGrath, 784, Brecht, Joan Littlewood. So you are looking at the popular as a commercial enterprise.
Yeah, I wanted in some way to look at these, if you like, forgotten or less often discussed plays. And I wanted something that was relatively objective. Because I think, as we all can understand, it's extremely difficult to know how effective, what kind of influence a particular play or series of plays has on the public. So knowing that there were 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000 or 8,000 performances of a certain play gave me at least a yardstick in which I could sort of select out of the many thousands of plays that have been produced since 1940. And yes, I did feel also, obviously, the choice of the title of the book is clearly a nod and a partial subversion of John McGrath's work, who's, I mean, you know, I really respect his work, his whole career, you know, the whole thing, but it's a different idea of the popular. I'd stick my neck out a tiny bit and say that it's more in the kind of area of almost Leninist thinking about a small group of people who know the truth about class society and who go out and tell unenlightened, ordinary people what that truth is. Perhaps I'm exaggerating that, but certainly it's a different way of looking at theatre than straight commercial criteria.
In Rewriting the Nation, you spoke about many of the plays written after 2000 as illustrative of what you call the dream life of the nation. So what is the plays and the performances in Good Nights Out telling us about the dream life of the British nation? Did you come to any conclusions about the sort of obsessions and interests that the British public have had since, say, 1940 to the present day? Can you say what constitutes popular performances for audiences?
Yeah, that's also a good question. Clearly, it's an enormous subject, so I'll try and be brief on this one. Yeah, dream life, obviously, that's a nod also to Benedict Anderson, the idea that we live as a nation in our imaginations of a community. And of course, that kind of collective dream, I'm always thinking that what is important is knowing that a lot of people are participating in that dream. So the idea of popular culture, I think, sort of feeds into that, in the same way as the fact that a lot of people watch Strictly Come Dancing live on TV rather than on iPlayer now. Indicates something about the way we respond to a particular aspect of popular culture at the moment. And in fact, I've been conscious that although I've focused on theatre and British theatre in this particular book, I would be very interested to read a book which compared popular theatre in Britain, whether it's British, American, or French, with that same decade's pop music, popular films, popular novels, because that would give, I think, a much more nuanced account of how over the decades, British culture has changed or developed. So clearly in the immediate post-war decades, the idea of a service comedy, plays that in some ways talk about the experience of life in the army, quite patriotic. They're not those kind of anti-war plays in any sense, but at the same time, they are always skeptical of authority. They're anti-authoritarian. They tend to be very class conscious. Those kind of plays interested me. And of course, they die out in the 1950s. And eventually, I think in the 1970s, they're taken up by television in the guise of Dad's Army, which has haunted Sunday afternoons, I think, on the BBC ever since. So, you know, that would be one sort of big trend about the way the British people thought about the war and so on. Another trend would be the vogue for crime plays that also die out when television takes over in the 70s and 80s. Sex plays and sex comedies of the 1970s after the end of censorship. I think there's a similar story there, that something that was a very gendered form, if you like, of entertainment gradually falls out of fashion. I think in some ways the influence of American culture grows increasingly strong from the 80s, 90s up till now. So there are those really big trends, but I would personally like to see more, if you like, cross-media study of these kinds of phenomenon. What were the most popular genres and examples of a particular era, and what do they say about what fascinated us as a nation?
It's interesting because I'm looking through the contents, and you've divided it into chapter 1, war, comic, tragic, and nostalgic, and you've included plays like Seagulls Over Sorrento, crime, classical, farcical, and postmodern. You've included the Mousetrap, sleuth, sex, comic, episodic, and ironic. There's a Girl in My Soup, Oh Calcutta. Family, traditional, redemptive, and fractured. So Sailor Beware, Spring and Port Wine, Curious Incidents of the Dog in the Nighttime. Class, musical, parodic, and political. Charlie Girl, Blood Brothers, Billy Elliot. Then you go into history, Gothic, Edwardian, and pastiche. Phantom of the Opera, 39 Steps, for example. And then finally, fantasy, whimsy, camp, and sci-fi. So Salad Days, Rocky Horror Show, Return to the Forbidden Planet, Matilda the Musical. Were there any choices or things you found that hit over 1,000 performances that genuinely surprised you that they'd reached 1,000 performances and over?
Yeah, I think the biggest surprise, and it was kind of a nasty surprise, because I mean, you've done, thank you very much for advertising the contents of my book. The 7 chapters, I mean, some of them in a way wrote themselves. I think that you can't really study British culture since the Second World War without mentioning images of that war in one way or the other. Crime obviously wrote itself because of the phenomenal importance and success of The Mousetrap by Agatha Christie. Sex was an obvious kind of indicator of the difference between pre-censorship and post-censorship theatre. So pre-1968 and post-1968. You can't really talk about British culture unless you talk about class in one way or another. The Family I thought would be interesting because it's domestic, and arguably it's one area that has changed a lot sociologically in the various decades. Families now, I think, are much more complicated. There's many more step parents and so on than there were in the past, and I wondered how that was reflected. History, I was interested in history, so I thought I'd do a chapter on that. And fantasy, I thought, well, you know, the Rocky Horror Show has got to go somewhere. And that kind of led me down the path of fantasy. Obviously, also Matilda, one of my favorites. I'm not a very cerebral, or if you like, even intellectual writer. So I didn't plan this out coherently, starting at the beginning and working my way through. I had lots of vague intuitions about what I wanted to write about. And obviously there were several shows that are favorites of mine. I really wanted to write about The Mousetrap, not because it's a work of literary genius, but because it's a fantastically, I think, interesting show. And it's a global phenomenon, like of which, I mean, you had, you know, if it wasn't in this book about popular theatre, then, I mean, it's ridiculous. So there were choices like that that were kind of obvious. Sometimes, as with Charlie Girl, the musical, I sort of was quite interested because I'd never heard of it, or I'd heard of it but didn't know anything about it. So I thought, this would be quite interesting to research. I mean, the book is driven by research. I spent a lot of what I think are very pleasurable hours in the V&A Performance Archive in Blythe House, now sadly closed, I think, almost forever. They have these folders of each theatre show, which includes programs, includes reviews, includes magazine articles. And quite often they gifted me a lot of good material for the book. So for example, whenever anybody in a review talked about escapism, I thought, yes, well, this is one of my subjects. Thank you very much. Whenever a reviewer or a journalist or somebody else used the phrase, this is a good night out, I thought, thank you very much, that's going in. Do you see what I mean? There was a lot of kind of exploratory going through some of these things. And also I wanted a sense of variety. I didn't want it just to be Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals end to end. You could write a book with 7 chapters about Andrew Lloyd Webber. That'd be perfectly fair enough. I also wanted to explore slightly more uncomfortable figures like Paul Raymond, you know, the great pornographer of the 1970s. And, you know, I was kind of, I mean, maybe I'm naive, but I was very amazed because he worked with Victor Spinetti, who used to be at the Theatre Royal Stratford East, Joan Littlewood's theatre company. I thought, what? Victor Spinetti, you know, he's directing a sex show for Paul Raymond. You know, I was surprised by sort of little discoveries like that. And in constructing the book, eventually I stumbled upon a way of looking at each chapter, which would be an introduction, which talked about the cultural significance of the theme. And then what I would do typically was choose 3 plays that were from the kind of heyday of that kind of sensibility or that kind of genre, and then tried to contrast that with a final play which was much more recent. So for example, in the chapter about the war, I was talking about Terence Rattigan's perhaps least revived play, although there has been a recent revival at the Orange Tree. Yeah, While the Sun Shines. I thought, wow, you know, that's his most popular play, and I've never heard of it, you know. So, and it's about the war, so that went into that chapter. You mentioned Seagulls Over Sorrento and so on and so forth. I threw in a farce as well, Reluctant Heroes, you know, that kind of thing. That's about national service. And then the final play in that particular chapter was Warhorse, which I thought gave a much more contemporary idea of the war play, and also enabled me to say things about the National Theatre's role in using state subsidy to develop work and then transferring it to the commercial sector, or you know, making it a mega hit, if you like. So yeah, so that's how most of this kind of turned out. Yeah.
Like an embarrassing uncle at a wedding, did you find any? Did you find? That's right. I made you spill your water there. Did you find any embarrassing, or what would now be seen as embarrassing hits from the past, which perhaps we would want to sideline or bury?
Yeah, careful, Graham. You're getting perilously close to the sort of cancel culture here. But yeah, definitely there are.
I should be getting onto the university czar.
Exactly. No, there were some shows that I would quite gladly cancel, actually. So, for example, you know, Oh Calcutta. You know, Kenneth Tynan's, excuse me, sex show from the late 60s, early 70s. You've probably seen this yourself. There's a DVD of an American production of it. And, you know, it's execrable. It's excruciating to watch. You know, personally, I thought, ugh, you know, that is so, you know, unpleasant and
it's a very misogynistic piece.
Yeah,
very misogynistic.
You know,
John Lennon's.
Yeah, we kind of sort of think, oh, you know, the past was different, and it certainly was when you look at something like that. So those kind of sensibilities, you know, while acknowledging that obviously it did some work in the world as a sort of project, I found it embarrassing to think about. The chapter that I wanted to write, but I couldn't find a way of writing, was obviously one about race. And there are very few, as far as I know, there are very few plays in which race is represented in any kind of affirmative or realistic way that are mega hits, that have, you know, been hugely successful. And in fact, the embarrassing thing about trying to write a chapter about race is that you'd have to write about the Black and White Minstrel Show, a blackface show that was phenomenally successful. And then also maybe things like Ippy Tomby, the musical, which is a kind of advertisement for how happy Black people are under apartheid in South Africa. And I thought, do I really want to go there? So the pleasure of writing about something like Five Guys Named Mo or The Lion King, I mean, you have to remember I was writing this before Hamilton arrived, which does actually in some way sort of question these kind of old stereotypes. But if you like, that is the missing chapter, the one on race. And if I was writing it today, I might have written it with Hamilton as the final example in that chapter on the same model as those previous ones. There's a couple of questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, the Andrew Burton's, well, actual fact, just this, I'll go for Alexander Millington's first. Actual fact, interesting that you're not related totally to Mary Millington, are you, Alexander? Who starred in a lot of in pajama tops, if I recall. He says that sex features regularly in British theatre during different time periods. And through my research, I believe it's making a resurgence in theatre today. So would you agree with this observation? And do you think, Alex, that sex and intimacy features in contemporary drama in the same purpose as it did during the 1990s? So there's an in-your-face question smuggled in there as well.
Yeah, well, certainly I think that in drama and theatre shows that are often aimed at much smaller audiences than large commercial plays, I think that sex obviously has had a continuous fascination for playwrights and so on. And those questions of intimacy are really good ones. In commercial theatre, I'd have to sort of think a bit more about some of the musicals and so on to answer that. I'm not sure if I can think of a recent sex comedy that had the same status as No Sex Please, We're British, had in the late 70s. So I'm not quite sure about that, but well, you know, I'd say to Alexander Millington, I would say this is a great subject for you to research. And I'd love to know what conclusions you drew from that, because it is a huge subject, but an interesting one, of course. Yeah.
Andrew Burton asks a question. He says, Alex, what do you think about the introduction of national arts funding from the mid-1940s? So we're talking SEMA here.
Yeah.
Had on the development of popular plays. And a great quote, he says, also, what do you make of Orton's aphorism? You know, there was someone who believed in the popular, but there is no intrinsic merit in a flop.
Oh, good. Yeah, I mean, flops are great to write about, and I've read a book, I've forgotten who it's by now, that is just solely devoted to flops, and it makes fantastic reading, of course. So yeah, definitely there's a merit in reading about them. I don't know about sort of writing about them. Okay. I'm not quite sure about SEMA and the connection. I didn't immediately see much connection between that and the service comedies of the 1940s, but I could be wrong about that. I did focus very much on commercial theatre on the West End, and looking at shows that clearly were led by producers and by production companies that were aiming to make a profit and to have long runs and so on. I think SEMA was important in that it tended to wake people up all around the country about the possibilities of theatre and opera and so on. And of course, the Arts Council also was very important in that. I tended to look more recently at Nick Heitner and his producer Nick Starr at the National Theatre, which is a subsidised institution, or at the Royal Shakespeare Company, who developed musicals like Matilda, and obviously the National Theatre, One Man, Two Governors, War Horse, Curious Incident, all of these plays, which they then transferred themselves to the West End without using a commercial partner, so that the theatres gathered a lot of profit for themselves instead of sharing it with somebody who hadn't contributed to that development. So I think there's definitely, once again, there's a good MA thesis there about the interplay between funding and popular theatre. So yeah, Andrew, go ahead.
The next question, I've taken you to task about this, Alex, in the past, about your London-centric bias in your views on British theatre. You need to get out more. My thoughts. But John Bennett,
it's a bit difficult. It's something called lockdown, but all right, yeah.
Given John Bennett's expertise in Hull truck, I think this is a very pertinent question.
Yeah.
He says, is it possible to be popular without being popular in London?
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. I don't really know enough about particular productions at Hull Truck or the work of Alan Ayckbourn, apart from what I know happened in London. Alan Ayckbourn really is, if you like, the sort of bad conscience of my book, because none of his West End hits actually managed to reach the magic 1,000 number. Okay, some of them failed. That just shows you how I look at it. They failed by 25 or 50 or 100 performances, so not by a huge amount. But of course, by the 1990s, Alan Ayckbourn was the most performed modern playwright, I think, in the entire UK. So he has enormous reach, if not particular longevity for particular productions. So on the other hand, I didn't want to write all about Alan Ayckbourn because it's been done by people who are much better than I am at writing about him. So for that reason, but that's a really good example. And Godber, of course, I don't know enough about how many performances they managed to get or how wide their reach was. Certainly, I should have perhaps said more about touring productions. I don't know. I don't know enough about what popular theatre is in Wales or in Scotland or even in Northern Ireland. So if that's a criticism, I hold up my hands and say, yeah, that's justified.
You do talk about Willie Russell, to be fair.
Yeah. And there's a whole, I mean, you know, the contribution of people, writers from the north of England and from Northern Ireland and Scotland, obviously, and Wales, is very significant. And yeah, my sort of feeling always when I'm taken to task about being London-centric is to throw it back and say, you write the story of popular theatre in Scotland, you know? And I'd love to know about it. And you don't have to say, oh, it's got to be 1,000 performances. That's an arbitrary, you know. You know, if you talk to somebody in Scotland, what theatre have they seen? Yeah. How significant was, you know, John McGrath's touring work? You know, was it just a lovely evening where you could sing along and have a lot of fun? Or did it have, you know, precise political effects? You know, so crossing between the two notions of the popular, I would really love to, you know, I'd love a history of post-war British theatre from the point of view of Manchester or Birmingham. You know, why not? You know, all of those, you know, let's call them northern towns, you know? Why not? Except I don't think that, you know, those have been written as far as I know, but I'm happy to be corrected. I'm happy to find out about them.
William Bowles asks one of those awkward questions about why didn't you include Yasmina Reza's art? As I always love the quote that in Dominic Drumgoll's The Full Room, when he just says Yasmina Reza très riche.
Yeah. Hi, William. It's a good question once again. The reason for that is that I decided to focus when I was writing a whole section on British plays and British musicals. I mean, clearly, if I was taking a much, if the publisher had given me 450 pages instead of 225, I would have happily written about Oklahoma, for example, the Book of Mormon. I'd love to have written about that. I've already mentioned Hamilton. So I would then maybe have widened things to that kind of French contribution to British culture. And of course, Mark Camoletti's work, those comedies, and certainly art. I think I spend about 4 sentences on it. It's in there somewhere, but I didn't write a whole section on it. And actually, it's a really good example of quite a sophisticated play that also was amazingly popular. And I think, of course, by the frequent changes of cast and the big name actors that they had for that. And I think that that's one explanation. And also because it's a funny, but also intelligent play. And yeah, once again, I surrender, anyone wanting to write maybe not a thematic, but a chronological history of popular theatre after the Second World War, could spend 2 or 3 pages on Yasmin and Reza. Yeah, absolutely.
Stephen Hadley asks, I think, a really interesting question. And he's saying, given that what we know about the social stratification and consumption, i.e. audiences, the implication then that the audience are the ones writing our national conversation could at the very best be seen as problematic.
Okay, why do we think that's problematic?
I think Stephen could. Do you want to follow that up, Stephen?
Hi, Stephen.
Hang on. You've taken me off mute. Brilliant. Why do I think that's problematic?
Yeah.
Well, there's a significant amount of data now that we've had for many years, whether that's DCMS is taking part, whether it's the work of the Warwick Commission on Cultural Value, whether it's work that's been done across art forms or regions from box office data.
Yeah.
And uniformly over well in excess of a decade, that data shows that there's a very specific, small, predominantly white, well-educated, well-off middle class who are consuming subsidized culture, and more than that are perfectly able to put their hands into their deeper pockets without the need for subsidy, which could potentially be directed somewhere else. So I've always found the idea that theatre is part of our national conversation problematic, because when one considers it at a conceptual level, that's fine. But when you actually consider it in terms of who is the audience for this work and who thereby is having this conversation, it immediately seems to me problematic. So I find it uneasy. I mean, I know you use the terminology kind of dream life, I think it was, but I kind of think that's another way of saying national conversation in the same way as saying national literature. So I guess it's just problematic. And I
understand now. Yeah, absolutely. And I share your unease. I write about theatre, so I was interested in how theatre audiences, especially audiences for very, very extremely popular shows, might react to what they're, let's call it, experiencing. I'm not sure that the middle class, highly educated audience that you're talking about is the only audience that goes to see Wicked or Warhorse or the shows that I've been writing about. And I'm not sure that in the 1940s, for example, that it was an exclusively middle-class audience that went to see the Whitehall farces, for example. So I challenge this idea that theatre is so exclusive over all of these decades. I do take your point, though, that it is problematic to be talking about the dream life of the majority of the population without acknowledging that people are excluded from that majoritarian view of the world. And indeed, I devote a whole paragraph to that in the introduction. I acknowledge that certain social groups have been excluded from popular culture. This is why I personally love to read a book about 1960s pop culture that mentioned all of these different forms and tried to make more precise what their audiences exactly were. And I think that that would be perhaps more illuminating than just looking at it from the point of view of one art form. But this is the art form that I'm interested in, so hey.
I'd also add Elaine Aston and Jerry Harris's book, Good Nights Out for the Girls, where they talk about the demographic of middle-aged, mainly middle-aged women who are going out to see Mamma Mia as a sort of en masse.
Or Dirty Dancing or Priscilla or whatever. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's complicated, but I think Stephen's question is a really interesting one.
It is. It is.
What we're talking about. Kath Badham makes, I think, more of an observation actually than a question, but it's a good observation that about the resurgence of popular shows coming from outside of London.
Absolutely.
Everyone's talking about Jamie.
Classic. Yeah, I think if, God forbid, perhaps, if I write a second edition, everybody's talking about Jamie is definitely a musical to include, and I'd be very happy to write about that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly right. I don't know whether it's simply because of the population and because of things like mass tourism and so on to London, that this becomes a place where you can have runs of over 1,000 consecutive performances, and whether you have to then transfer to London to achieve that. I'd like to know more about the exact histories of all of these shows. And in fact, I think this raises a slightly different subject, which is also another huge area of potential research. I would like to see more books that looked at theatre shows as a production from beginning to end, if you see what I mean, rather than most books that talk about theatre shows as the press night and nothing else. Obviously, it's difficult to get information. You'd have to see the show reports. You'd have to look at cast changes. You'd have to look at, I don't know, interviewing the cast to see the stories behind the scenes and so on. But I'd really like, the whole point of theatre is that it's repeated live every night. And yet that is so difficult, firstly, to grasp. I'd really like to know how, everybody's talking about Jamie, how it was originally perceived, how it's perceived when it's in London. A lot of these shows in my book moved from theatre to theatre. Did that affect the way they were performed? Probably. Did that affect who went to see them? Maybe. And I'd really like to know more about that. And of course, the Mousetrap is your classic example. It's not a show that's been uniform over the years. One obvious thing about it is that the acting originally was probably quite straight. And now it's often, in inverted commas, it's often the actors are trying to be ironic deliberately. And I think that's a change. When did that happen? 1980s, 1970s, who knows? Once again, this is an enormous field of research. The whole thing that Stephen mentioned about audiences is also something, it's kind of great to see Arts Council statistics about their audiences, but what about commercial theatre? do those companies keep information about their audiences? I don't know enough about it to be able to talk confidently, but I suspect, once again, there's an enormous field of interest there. For example, I'd love to know how many shows have repeat visits by members of the audience. You know, are all those big musicals sustained by repeat visits, or are they not? You know, are they all fresh people coming to see Mamma Mia or whatever? So, you know, there are lots of questions that I was unable to explore fully in what is really an introductory book rather than a magisterial final word on the subject, if such a thing is possible.
I'd like to throw questions out now to beyond the chat function, if people would actually like to sort of ask questions directly to,
or make a point
at this moment.
Yeah. Maybe not.
Maybe not. One thing, while people are just turning on their mics, one thing that did strike me was an area that would be a really interesting aspect of furthering research are cities that put on popular performances for their city. So
Yeah.
Birmingham had a tradition, it
Yeah.
unfortunately has stopped in recent years, of putting on the Brummie musical.
Yeah.
Hugely popular.
Yeah.
It was often sentimental. I know the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool have done this, but it's for the city.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any pretensions about leaving the environment of the city itself. I don't know whether such things exist in Paris, but where the history and the people and the culture of that city is celebrated. I guess also the community play is another area we haven't spoken about. The work of Angelico and the Dorchester community plays that
absolutely, yeah.
That populists like Howard Barker wrote The Poor Man's Friend. You know, certainly someone who hates the idea of popular theatre. For him, what is it he calls? The community is a blunted thing, but he writes a community play.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s.
Yeah. Oh, I think that whole field is so rich. That would make fantastic research and a fantastic publication. I'd love to know more about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question directly for Aleks,
or a point that you'd like to make?
I just wanted to say Sheffield has done an awful lot of that, writing about the city and for the city and the community play in recent years. The Chris Bush has written quite a lot, including Standing on the Sky's Edge, which is the Richard Hawley musical, which I think is also possibly transferring to London at some point. He's done a version of the mystery plays for Sheffield, all of that recently, and he's done she's done stuff for Stoke as well, I think. So she's written an awful lot in that genre for Sheffield over the last few years, to do with Sheffield People's Theatre.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Kath.
I'm just really intrigued by the idea of returning audiences, Aleks. I hadn't thought about it until you said, and of course immediately Rocky Horror Show springs to mind because of the participation nature of that. But I'm very conscious that Blood Brothers comes to Liverpool, or used to, the Empire every Christmas, runs for about 3 weeks and sells out. And I can't believe there's a single member of that audience that hasn't seen Blood Brothers before. It's become the sort of pantomime equivalent in that sense.
Yeah, that's a really good example. And I'm glad you mentioned the Rocky Horror Show, which is, you know, personally a favorite of mine. I can see people groaning immediately, but well, I suppose what interested me about that show is that it's a cult musical. And of course, it was when audience members started to dress up as characters from the musical and attend like that, and then tended to participate and create a kind of audience experience, an immersive participatory experience, that the whole thing really took off, both here and in the United States. and both with the stage version and of course with the film version. And I suppose that that is a sort of cult phenomenon that's completely different, if you like, from some of the you know, mass tourism, if you like, productions. So I do think this is quite a complicated subject, especially once you start looking in detail at audiences. And of course, I was delighted whenever I read in any of the research that people were saying, oh, many more people are coming to see this show over and over and over again. And I thought, yes, that's interesting. Yeah. So thanks, John. Yeah, that's a really good point, and especially about Blood Brothers. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, maybe something. Thank you. Thank you. It was fascinating listening to you. Got me thinking about the notion of pleasure. What you're saying about about bringing out an alternative history to post-war British theatre goes alongside with perhaps rehabilitating pleasure, like a sort of light-hearted pleasure. Does that? Yeah, could you explain?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely one of the things that well, I don't like writing books unless I'm enjoying the subject matter. So maybe that says something about me. Maybe I'm just not critical enough. But you know, I like to think if I'm going to devote time in doing research and so on, it has to be something where I can perceive the pleasure in that particular artwork. And of course, in some of the classic musicals, that's extremely easy. At least I think, you know. And also, you know. Yeah,
but then that puts the question of what kind of pleasure are we experiencing when we're not watching a popular play? I mean, the foil that we could have.
Oh yeah. Oh well, I mean, clearly there's a pleasure, if you like, in being challenged emotionally or with taboo breaking material or whatever, or things that are excruciatingly sad or whatever. But I think pleasure for me usually means some form of uplift. And going back to John McGrath, he spends about 4 or 5 pages talking about what he calls working class aesthetics. I would call them popular aesthetics, because I think this division between working class and middle class or bourgeois, one is good, the other's bad, is a bit old-fashioned. I think it's much more complicated and fluid now. I'm not saying we live in a classless society. I'm just saying that those divisions as ways of looking at audiences or at artworks are very superseded, I think. But John McGrath talks about working class aesthetics, and he says things like working class audiences like clarity. Yeah, I think one of the pleasures of very popular theatre, mega hits that I call them, is the clarity of what's happening. And that's amazingly democratic, you know. I love Carol Churchill's work, but I think sometimes you need to be a specialist to understand what's going on, you know, and not to mention Howard Barker, as you've done, Graham. So yes, we're looking at a way of creating popular theatre which prioritizes clarity, storytelling, perhaps a moral point where it's easy, you know, there isn't a huge amount of ambiguity. I think that's right. Or if there is, it's ironically, you know, signaled to the audience, as in all those spoofs like 39 Steps, or even The Woman in Black. You know, there's a sense that the writers know that the audience understands genre, so they're going to play a little bit with it. And that's also pleasure, because the audience recognizes something and presumably enjoys it because they keep coming back. So, you know, but it is a very good question about how do we conceptualize this? How do we write about it? I mean, as a form of self-criticism, I would say, yeah, I tend to gush when I write about pleasure. Yeah, okay, that's, you know, I think that's, it also brings back this sense of what I call the literary gaze in the book. For a long time, the way we've looked at post-war British theatre is because we admire plays for their literary qualities. In other words, it's theatre as literature. And there's a good reason for this, because the play text is something that remains after everything else is packed away, people's memories fade and so on. So I can understand why people concentrate on the text. And of course, I've written books about play text. But the thing about popular theatre is, I think that it's almost always, and I say almost, non-literary, okay? Basically, it's theatrical in the sense that some of the most popular plays are genre plays. They are plays that depend on physical comedy. They are musicals that depend on fantastic spectacle, that kind of thing, singing, dancing. It's very non-literary, it's not textual theatre. So I think that although as academics, we've often said, oh, you know, the text is just a blueprint and so on, when it came to writing about history or plays in the past, we have tended to concentrate on ones which had an interesting play text, rather than looking at forms like farce and comedy, where other theatrical things are happening.
Thank you, great, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
I'm aware that time is starting, we're starting to come to the end.
Okay.
Do you have any last questions for Aleks?
If you don't mind, rather than a question, I have a remark.
Yeah. Oh, good.
What is interesting in what you were saying was the fact that a lot of the plays you are mentioning, the fact that London is a sort of mecca for former colonies, former British colonies. I come from Malta myself, and a lot of the plays you are mentioning are acted in Malta because they are London plays.
Yeah.
They are advertised as London plays.
Yeah.
And that is part of their attraction. The fact that they were played in London sort of gives them a pedigree that is going to ensure popularity in Malta, because people will go and see it because it was played in London.
Yeah, that's really, yeah. That's a really good point. And I'd go slightly further in, of course, once again, within the constraints of writing a relatively short book, I don't think you can do everything, but it fascinates me that a lot of productions are created as industrial artifacts, in the sense that the most common one would be a musical that is first staged in London. After a while, it is staged in a similar design, perhaps with similar directing and acting in other cities all over Europe, or in Japan, or in Australia, or Malta, or wherever. So yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said about touring productions. There's a lot to be said about local offshoots from the metropolis, or the whatever, the cosmopolis, or whatever. So yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you very much. Thanks, Vicky.
Any last questions for Aleks?
Yes, I would have a question. I hope it's all right to do a little detour. I'm writing my dissertation on in-your-face theatre at the moment.
Oh, right.
Yeah, I know it's not the exact topic, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
But I was wondering, where you stand on in-your-face theatre kind of within the contemporary, the relevance of in-your-face theatre within the contemporary playwriting, and especially maybe playwrights like Sarah Kane's role within the topic and restaging it in today, really.
Yeah. It's kind of a big subject and one that I haven't been thinking about recently. So can I do something really horrible, Anna, and ask you to email me that question? And I promise I will respond by email. And obviously that's a clever way of getting out of answering it right now. But yeah, you know my email address, do you? I mean, it's on my website, so it's very easy to find me. Please do.
Of course, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It strikes me that, Alex, though, that a lot of in-your-face plays now could be, particularly Sarah Kane, particularly Blasted, could be read via Me Too.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
There's a gaslighting play.
Yeah.
There's a play about manipulation and grooming and sexual coercion.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, what interests me about the popular theatre shows that we're talking about is the possibility, obviously, of revivals. And we haven't really discussed this because I think some of them are unrevivalable, if you see what I mean. But it would interest me, for example, to see two plays, one from the past that we're familiar with, like An Inspector Calls, being revived alongside ones that we're not familiar with, like Worm's Eye View, for example. So, you know, matching up plays from the past. As regards Sarah Kane's work, I think recently it's kind of fallen off the kind of repertoire, as far as I know, a bit. I think there was a Crave at Chichester last year, if I remember rightly. But I think she's no longer quite as central to our imagination of what the contemporary is. As you pointed out, she could be. Whether that will change, I don't know.
Okay, I think it's probably ready to end there. We all probably want to get the dinner on and feed the cat. Can I thank Alex for coming along today to talk about his new book? It's a cracking read. It's as usual, it has that blend of erudition and Alex's crackling prose, which is a really which makes it an absolute pleasure to read. So thank you again, Alex.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for participating. That's really great. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
you.